All right, yay. I think we might be live to citizens. Oh man, it is cold in here. HB1, when you get a minute. When you get a minute, I'd like to zoom in on this camera. On camera 1, I think it is.
Yeah. What the fuck is Farmers Eat an Iced Coffee?
What is what?
Farmers?
I don't know. It's in the notes.
Well, they're your notes.
No, they're in the original notes. I just copied them over.
Oh.
So I have no idea. Yeah. Can you zoom in anymore?
Yes. You can zoom in all the way here.
Let's pick up the camera and move it physically closer.
A second.
You're right about there. That's better. I'll look this way, so you'll want to have extra leading room on, just a little bit of extra room on this side, so that as I'm looking this way, it makes sense. That cool? Sweet, and I'm in focus and all that jazz?
There we go.
Thank you.
Now don't move.
Do you really want the mic
Ever.
on your left side if you're going to be facing right mostly?
No, that's a good point. It needs to be on this side,
Yeah.
but I need to do some shenanigans to make that happen. All right. Yes?
So this iPad was just updated. It's demanding passcode be created. You want
Oh no, just skip at the bottom.
passcode options and back.
Yep, passcode options.
There we go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Didn't mean to throw you off. I just.
No, you're not wrong. I realized I can't do it without a mirror. Did you want to show all of the citizens your tattoo?
Sure.
No, you don't have to.
No, I guess the microphone stays outside of your zipper. Is that?
I think that's all right. Like I'm listening, and the shirt has good. It's like taut. It's taut and not showing off too much stuff. Shouldn't be showing off. Cool. Trying to make it not awkward for everyone.
Yeah. No, I know.
I'm gonna
Yeah, I
push
think
that.
you taught it
The
too
problem
much.
is I'm gonna like I'm not comfortable with it like too, whatever. But like, how's that? I think it seems to look okay on camera. Like you can't tell on that if you look at the camera feeds, because that's what matters, right? You can't really tell on that one, and you can't really tell on that one. You don't have a point of reference, right? You can't really tell. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Okay, so I put the guest info first, and then I did the coming up, but it's labeled with coming up. See, or is that not?
It should be coming up first, and then the guest info. Although you can.
You tell me. It should be
Yeah.
like
So
copy and paste.
the order in the rundown is the correct order.
Okay, but you want his name up first.
No, I guess what I'm saying is, hang on one second. What I like to do is, you can, once I'm done blowing through the coming up, you can delete that information. And once I'm done with the guest info, you can delete that information too. Just leave the top line for me.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
And then this was separated out, but I didn't know why.
Because they're different notes, so, and we don't really have the ability to do a space. Maybe do like dashes, just so that I've got some sort of separator there.
Okay. that warm enough?
Not yet, but I'm sure it will be. Thank you. There we go. Also, hello, Internet. I went live a little bit early because I figured I would say hi. For those of you, whoa. For those of you watching the Citizen stream, hi, first off. Secondly, the main chat room is over on the YouTube page because I don't have a really great way to deal with the Citizen chat room just yet. So sorry about that. I'll pop over to the main chat room for now just so I can see you guys. Yeah, there you go. That's a good call. How did I ask if it's Richards or Richardson, like in the... according to my information, it's Richards. I don't know where Richardson came from. Tars, we don't want people in the other chat room. We want everyone to focus on the main YouTube chat for now. I think that's the goal isn't to pull everything together. The goal is to have everyone focus on the YouTube chat at this point. And so by splitting the Citizen chat out, they still wouldn't have access unless they actually go over there, which is why we disable it in that side. Yeah. Yep. Cool. So yeah, so I know that there aren't very many people in the chat room right now, but if anyone's watching, any questions for me or any fun things prior to this flashing screen is annoying. I wish I could do something about that. It's really not great. I could use this screen, but that's not going to be a thing. I need to re-terminate the cable, but I don't have a compression kit with me, so I can't do it. Got my new avatar everywhere. And Colton, I uploaded my avatar and it did not crash the chat room. So that's new and different. New avatar. Yay. Now I gotta figure out how to, oh, cool. Why do I have key clicks turned on? Sounds. Keyboard clicks off. Jeez. Ringing alerts off. Silent mode. What? Well, change with buttons. There we go. Why did they make this so complicated? I thought iOS was supposed to be easy. Yeah, I don't, and then to Heldesk's comment that's been pushed red, is it Richards or Richardson like in the title card? I don't know. I didn't build the title card. I think Lisa did, which means she also built the guest info in the calendar. And according to the calendar info and the invite, where did that go? Oh, it is Richardson. Well, where did Richards come from? Oh, you know, I didn't make the YouTube invite. That's why. All right, I'm going to go fix that. Sorry. Oh, the heater's nice. Yeah, the heater's helping. Oh, it's in the title card. I can't fix the title card. I don't have that graphic. They didn't send that to me. I can't fix it. Sorry, everyone. It's Richardson. It's like it is. So the calendar invite is most likely correct. I think when the card was created, or when the slate card was created, it was created wrong. Oh, no, so hang on. You can delete those, HB1. I think we're still not in sync on this. So delete what you got. Oh, she doesn't have her ears in yet. Oh, yeah, okay, go ahead and delete. No. So put it in exactly as you see it in the rundown, including his name in the other location. So the rundown has the correct order. I'll come in there. The rundown is the exact order I'm going to go in.
Right.
Right. So
Other than his name.
No, his name is in the correct place.
Fine.
So as you delete things, just don't delete his name.
Right. Okay.
Right? And then his name will end up at the top.
I understand.
His name is incorrect in the rundown, yes?
Right. His name in the rundown is Richards.
That's interesting. How did it become Richards?
I don't know.
Ah, we must have split information between the rundown and the calendar.
Okay. That's why I'm asking if it's
I don't-
Richards or Richardson.
I don't know then. We're going to have to wait for him to come on.
Okay. Great.
Oh, this is open. Which will be interesting. Dutta, what do I have for a banner? I can't hear you if you put it up.
Richardson.
Okay, because I grabbed it from the calendar, which is where I always grab the information from, because that's from the direct Zoom invite.
His LinkedIn says Richardson.
Okay, where'd you find his LinkedIn?
Google.
Okay, that's what I did too, and it's the Japanese one?
Yeah.
Yep, okay. Then let's go with Richardson. That seems like the best bet. Oh. Oh, I need to get rid of this. I'm slightly more blind than Jared. Cool. Oh, the other nice thing about having the screen over there is you can see my screen now, can't you? Yeah? Okay, cool. So when I'm facing this camera, I'm going to need to use this, I think. I really should get like one of those at each location, but this gives me the opportunity to kind of like, this is what we're going to talk about, blah, 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 blah.
Isn't there a TV over there in the corner?
Yeah, but what am I going to feed it with? I can plug the TV into the wall and give it power. I could look at static, which is really looking at the universe itself.
Hidden splitter?
I don't have a Hidden splitter. They don't really make a splitter per se. You'd have to get a distribution amp.
Just spitballing.
I could will the pixels from one screen to the other, which is sometimes what I feel like I do at Company X.
Don't they bend to your will anyway?
No, they do not. My job would be so much easier if they did. Oh, man. Much like on this screen, they are definitely not bending to my will today. I say that, and now it actually stabilizes, but now I'm waiting for it to flash again.
Well, they're undecided.
Huh. Maybe when the pixels get cold, they get angry. All right.
They move slower.
So, Dada, my plan is they move slower. So they have. My plan is I'm going to do in the intro. I'm just going to go straight into what we're going to talk about on this show. We're going to be talking about reusable rocket engines. I want to know how we're going to define reusable versus refurbishable in a fun new game I call reusable versus refurbishable. We're also going to talk about extending the life of a rocket engine's thrust chamber and possibly, if we have time, Farmers Union iced coffee. I don't know. It's in the show notes. I have no idea either. Maybe we'll get to it. Maybe we won't. And talking about all of that today will be myself, Jamie Higginbotham, with my guest, Dr. Matt Richardson. Dr. Matt Richardson is an assistant professor at the University of Tokyo. He recently graduated with a PhD in reusable rocket engines at the JAXA, reusable rocket engines, I shouldn't say at JAXA. He worked on the Japanese reusable rocket engine, which is another thing I want to talk about because I didn't know they were working on one. I'm a terrible space geek.
I need like a bell and a buzzer. So every time you say reusable, I go
Ding!
Every time you say refurbishable,
All right. So then we're going to get into the our fun new game here on tomorrow called Reusable versus Refurbishable. First up, I have the RS-25 engine, and you've got an image of that. They're labeled 1 through 8, I believe. Cool. Yep. And then I don't actually have the list in front of me here. It'll be entered into the rundown when we get to that moment. But yeah, RS-25, and then I think Merlin is after that. What's the next one? What's number 2? Let's see if I can do these off the top of my head. Oh yeah, that's Merlin. What's number 3? That's a BE3, number 4. BE4, number 5. I best know that one. That's a Raptor. Number 6. Oh, that's the Aerospike engine. It's the linear one. It's the XS2200.
XRS.
XRS. Oh,
2200.
okay, 2200. Yep.
We have a guest.
Oh, hey. It's Dr. Richardson, correct? Or Richards? We had both in our rundown.
Richardson.
Richardson. Oh, awesome. By the way, thank you very much. You're calling from Japan right now, is that correct?
Yeah.
What time is it there?
It's almost 3 a.m.
Oh my God. Thank you so much for coming on the show at almost 3 a.m. I really appreciate that. I can only imagine what that's like.
Did you stay up late or wake up early?
That was probably one of the most difficult decisions I've made all year. But I decided to try and get a couple of hours of sleep.
Did it work, or do you regret that decision immediately?
So, I mean, I'm fresher than I would have been.
I do have a quick question for you.
Not really. I mean, I only just finished my PhD a few months ago, right? So I'm still in that sleep deprivation phase, or very easily can, I guess, transition back into it. So Yeah.
Quick question
Sorry,
for you.
I'm still, my computer just booted up, so I'm still, like, there's still messages and stuff popping up. I just wanted to try and iron all that out before we started.
Okay, cool. In the notes, I have Farmers Union iced coffee. That came from Lisa. So is that one where the story is best left untold until we hit the show itself, or is that one where I need some context before we get into any of that?
Not really. It's I mean, you're probably aware that. Sorry, the camera's cut out, and I don't know why. It's definitely an issue on my end, but so you're probably aware that Lisa went to the International Space University
Yep.
summer program in Adelaide. So I was obviously there with her, and I was a local, or I guess I'd been a local growing up. So a lot of the local cuisines, which are probably considered a bit working class, I guess, I really enjoyed.
Okay.
That a lot of people thought were rubbish, but I thought they were amazing. And Farmers Union iced coffee was one of them. There we are.
And then in the last segment, when we get to that, any embarrassing stories you have about Lisa. That basically that entire segment is just embarrass Lisa as much as you can. You can make stuff up. It doesn't have to be true. She just needs to be fully embarrassed. I think ultimately that's the fundamental goal here.
Right.
Cool. So I'm going to go live to the world in just a moment. But before I do, did you have any questions for me? By the way, this should be just a really fun, casual conversation about space. Just geek out, enjoy yourself. Yeah.
I am slightly worried that I know I know the I guess the viewers are really big space geeks, and I'm sort of worried that they'll ask a question I don't know how to answer, but
that's okay.
I've had experience with that.
No, we're filled with rocket scientists, and we also understand that I don't know is a valid answer, right? I mean, there's no way you can know absolutely everything on all knowledge of humanity. That's Google's job.
Right. And is it okay if I drink my coffee while we're live?
Yeah. Absolutely.
3 a.m.
Not only is it okay, it's expected at this point. We're a very casual
Fantastic.
show. Yeah. This is not formal at all. Just kick back, have fun, laugh, tell me stories that you enjoy. I've created a one-time segment I call reusable or refurbishable.
Right.
And I've got a bunch of different rocket engines, actually. Dada, you mind if we go through these one more time? So we're starting with a linear aerospike. Let's start back at 0, 1. There you go. So basically, I'm not in the first segment, but a little bit further on, I think we'll kind of ask, like, in your opinion, is this engine a reusable engine or a refurbishable engine? So we've got the RS-25. We've got the Merlin. We've got BE3 from Blue Origin. We've got BE4 from Blue Origin. By the way, I don't know to any of these is an acceptable answer. That is Raptor. I better know that one. That's the linear aerospike, the XRS 2200. Was that it, Dada?
Correct.
And that was on the Venture Star, right? You know that, I assume.
Yeah, I believe so.
That was on Venture Star. So by the way, once we hit the linear aerospike engine, that's where we start getting into the wacky, we haven't flown these are untested, untrue engines. So we had that one. What was next?
Right.
That is the RL-10 engine.
RL-10.
Yeah, which is
I know that one.
Yeah, I bet. That's not a wacky engine, but it's got like several different iterations, and it's like kind of the basis for a bunch of stuff. Is there anything after that? Oh, there is one after that. Here you go. I want to know your opinion on the Sabre engine from, what is the name of that craft? Skylon, the space plane, the single stage to orbit space plane reusable engine. So something to think about, and I'm going to ask for your definition, like how you personally define the difference between a reusable engine and a refurbishable engine, because that's been a topic of conversation here of like the space shuttle was not reusable, it was refurbishable. Right now, they're not really reusing Falcon rockets, they're refurbishing Falcon rockets. There's a big difference between an airplane and a rocket right now, at least in terms of reusability. And so how you choose to draw that line isn't really scientific right now, at least. It seems to be kind of like personal preference. So we'll kind of talk about where your preference for reusable versus refurbishable is, why it's there, and how you view those different engines. And by the way, any stories or loves or hates on each one of those engines as we get to them, or even, I don't know anything about that engine, that's totally cool too. Just go into it, right? Just have fun, enjoy yourself. Or be like, or we can whip through it really quick like a game show and be like, reusable, refurbishable, reusable, whatever you want to do.
It's your show, man. Whatever
Oh, no. This is your show at this point. All right. I'm supposed to ask about latency, but I feel like we're doing pretty good, right?
Seems to be better, yeah.
Okay, cool. I will be right back. I'm going to go press buttons that bring us live on the air, and then my chat room will fill up with people. And so just keep in mind that everything you say from this moment forward is on the public record.
Okay.
All right, kids. I hit the button. And YouTube says we're live. Hello, YouTube. Oh, and how would you like me to refer to you in the show? Do you want me to say Matt, Matthew, Dr. Richardson, Admiral, Captain, Space Cowboy?
Matt is fine.
Matt?
Matt's fine.
In your initial introduction, do you want it to be Dr. Matthew Richardson, or do you want me to be Dr. Matt Richardson, or because I'll use your full name at least once just for establishment. What do you prefer for the full name?
No one's ever asked me what I prefer for a full name. Probably Matthew.
Okay, cool.
I guess.
Cool.
But yeah,
we'll
definitely in conversation, Matt.
Yeah. We'll use that once kind of at the top of the show just for establishment, and then once that's done, it'll be Matt from there on out. Or Admiral or Captain. I might throw into Admiral or Captain in there randomly just to see what happens.
Actually, when I was a kid, you know, you can take those computer scored tests in high school and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I've kind of figured out they don't really check those before they feed them into the computer. So they give you an option of adding a title in, and I added Captain as a title. And that got put in some computer system, and for years later, I was getting stuff addressed to Captain Matthew Richardson.
I need to do that. That's brilliant. Lisa has joined the show, and she wants me to refer to you as, she said M9, but I think she meant to say Mr. Sir Matt San. There's a goo on the screen, so it's hard to read.
So M9 is a deliberate mistyping of M8, which is obviously pronounced mate.
Copy. Got it. Lisa, how was I supposed to read that out loud? That's crazy. Hang on. This is going to sound weird, but I need to take my teeth out. You can hear, like, the speech pattern is different when I have the trays in. If you haven't already, Dada, you're going to want to mute me. We're 8 minutes out. Show generally lasts somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes. It sort of really depends on the conversation. We target 42 minutes because that is the ultimate answer to life, universe, and everything. But we'll just
still haven't read that book.
At least you knew where it came from. So we'll just kind of go, and then do you have any, like, obviously it's dark 30 where you are. Do you have any hard outs? Are you going back to bed after this?
Probably not. I mean, I've already had one coffee, so
we should,
I don't think going back to bed's an option at this point.
I think what I want to do, I want like a little coffee meter in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, and every time you take a sip of coffee, it just increments by 1, just to see where by the end of the show how much coffee you've had. I think that would be fun.
Like I said, my body is still very much biologically tuned to thesis writing, so it'd go up and then just come straight back down and then go up again.
If ever you were to go to Mars, right now is the time to do it. Hello. So Colton is saying the main YouTube coffee score 1. Oh yes, we do. Thank you.
Yeah. Do you want a glass too?
Yeah, if you don't mind, that would be amazing. Thank you. Let's see here. Colton said the latency is high. That's because Biakua's. We're testing out 4K live streaming today, so you should be able to get this particular episode in all of the Ks. I believe YouTube requires that you use Chrome or the app itself. I don't think. Thank you very much.
Is that where you want that?
Yes, perfect. I don't think. Actually, I might make a quick move. I don't think Internet Explorer or Edge or Safari or Firefox will work that. Oh, my shirt is very Star Trek uniform-like. I should get a... Oh, 4K in Firefox does work. So anyhow, 4K also, unfortunately, forces me to use the highest latency on YouTube. I cannot turn that down, which is another reason to be a citizen. If you're a citizen of tomorrow, you get the ultra low latency stream. There should be like 4 seconds behind real time. And yes, I am using tomorrow to test technology for other things. Oh, hi, Jared. Jared is traveling today. We're 5 minutes out, everyone. Lisa also mentioned that you, Raptor might be a pet project that you would enjoy talking about.
I can speak to it if there's any questions, or I can try to. But to be honest, I haven't been following it that closely. Once again, I had to sacrifice a lot to get through the last few months of my PhD, and a lot of information consumption, I guess. So a lot of the most recent information that's come out about Raptor, I haven't had a chance to read. I tried to brush up on it a bit because I knew it might come up in this show, but yeah, it's. I don't mean to disappoint anyone.
Oh no, not at all.
It's not
I think we'll just
area of expertise.
We'll just talk about, yeah, I mean, we're just going to talk about reusable rocket engines in and of themselves, and then extending the life of thrust chambers and the ramifications of taking a thrust hit to the vehicle, because like you try to eke every ounce of performance out of these engines, and then going, yeah, don't do that. Has impact, right? I mean, if I'm to oversimplify it, there's an impact there.
Well, no, I think that's a perfect way to put it. And if you like, when we get into it, we can talk about a story from my PhD, which is basically mirrors what you just said.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. I absolutely want stories. So just find all of the stories. If the perfect interview is I say, hi, welcome to the show, tell me a story, and you talk for 42 minutes. That's almost a perfect show, actually. I do like to bring the coffee score is currently 3, just so you know.
So he's counting sips.
Yeah, I don't feel like counting sips is quite right. Like we need to count entire cups of coffee.
Yeah, I wanted to use. I've got a Japanese rocket coffee cup that's got sort of, as you go around the edges, it's got all of the different Japanese rockets throughout.
I do not understand
rockets
why
right
you are not drinking out of. Why are you not drinking out of the Japanese rocket coffee cup?
Because Japanese coffee cups are tiny. They're not big enough for me. So I have this Australian coffee cup.
You've got 2 minutes to prep it. You go get that, and that's your second stage. It gets you into orbit.
Ah, there you go. And then we'll know when you're in cup number 2, except the coffee will get cold by then.
Look, let me go and get it because it might actually fit in. So it's all right if I just
Oh yeah, go.
jump
go.
off the screen
Oh, you're
for
fine,
a minute
you're
here.
fine.
Okay, hold on.
Oh, hush, Wicked. We're testing stuff. It doesn't mean we're going to stay this way. I need to understand how everything works. If I have to take a minor step backwards just to understand it, I'm going to do that. But that's allowing me to use these shows to test technologies for other things is a smart thing in the long run. And you know that. That does not mean that this latency level will stick.
Okay.
Do you have it handy? I'd love to see it.
So I don't know if you can see that, but it starts with back in the 60s and the 70s, these very small sounding rockets.
Mm-hmm.
And it gradually progresses around as you go right up to the most recent ones. You can see the H1, H2, and H3 there, very iconic Japanese-looking rockets. And I guess I'm going to attempt to transfer
I'm going
what's
to
in this cup into this cup.
only good things
So,
will happen. At least you have 1G to work with.
Live propellant transfer experiment.
Yeah, exactly. This is a propellant transfer with the help of gravity. So here we go. There we go. Not a drop spill.
Brilliant.
It's almost like I've done it before.
All right, I'm going to head on over to the host room. Duddy, you ready?
Yes, sir. You want to start on camera 1?
Yeah, we'll start over here. Coming up on Tomorrow Orbit 12.35, we're going to be talking about reusable rocket engines. I'm going to ask some questions about what defines reusability versus refurbishability, and specifically we're going to be talking about extending the life of thrust chambers inside of the engine. And to do that, we're going to be talking with Dr. Matthew Richardson. He is an assistant professor over at the University of Tokyo and has been working on, well, he got a PhD in reusable rocket engines from JAXA and the University of Tokyo, and he joins me now. Also, I'm going to redo all of that because what I'd like to do is say my name next time. And we should bump from, I felt like there wasn't a good transition from coming up into guest info. Is that a good statement, Dada?
I think if you just lead with your name and then you get into your introduction, and then you can transition to the guest.
I like to lead with coming up even before my name.
Or truncate that, because that is a big mouthful.
You know what I'm going to do? Here's what I'm going to do. We don't need any of this. None of this matters. This is what matters right here. Right? So looking at host room, that's a better, yeah. So I'm going to say, coming up, we're going to be talking about reusable rocket engines. I personally want to know how we would define reusable versus refurbishable. We'll also be extending the life, how we can extend the life of thrust chambers, and maybe even talking about iced coffee. My name is Jamie Higginbotham, and I am joined today by Boom, and that's where we go to camera 2. Yes?
Instead of I personally want to know how we define reusable versus refurbishable, because that's a mouthful, we will talk about reusable rocket engines. What is reusable versus refurbishable? Extending the life of thrust chambers.
I think he's trying to make it more personal.
I'm trying to make it more
Literally
personal.
make
That takes the humanity out of it, I think. I'm okay with a mouthful.
Okay.
Yeah. Quiet control room. I giggling. And welcome to Tomorrow Space Orbit 12.35. Today we've got a really exciting show for you. We're going to be talking about reusable rocket engines. I specifically want to know how we're going to define the difference between reusable and refurbishable engines in a fun game I call reusable versus refurbishable. We're also going to be talking about extending the life of thrust chambers, and we might even talk a little bit about iced coffee. My name is Jamie Higginbotham, and joining me today is Dr. Matthew Richardson, who is the assistant professor at the University of Tokyo. All right, let's go ahead and get started straight off the bat. We're talking about reusable engines. You have a PhD essentially in reusable engines, and you're in Tokyo, or specifically Japan. I don't think of Japan and reusable rockets. So how did you, maybe that's just something mistaken on my part, but how did you end up in Japan?
Well, let me give you my entire life story then. So I started studying Japanese in high school, so a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, I guess. And I came to Japan as an exchange student for a year in high school, learned a lot of Japanese, learned a lot of culture, made a lot of friends, and then left and went back to Australia and started my career essentially as an engineer. And I was working in aerospace in Australia years and years later. And at that time, it didn't seem like there was much happening in terms of space. And that's where I always wanted to end up. So I spent a few years waiting for it to happen, and I realized it wasn't going to happen to me. I sort of had to make it happen. So I started looking at options to sort of go overseas and get involved in the space industry. And I loved propulsion systems. I've always loved that element of engineering, both jet propulsion and rocket propulsion. So I wanted to do that. But it's sort of a difficult field to get into because there's a lot of security concerns around it. So, for example, if it would have been great to go to the US and work on this sort of stuff there. But I was always concerned, especially coming from a defense industry background, that citizenship would be an issue in terms of getting into the really, really good stuff. So the US was never really an option. I guess Europe might have been an option, but that's like a completely different time zone. So, I wasn't willing to stomach a few hours of jet lag to change my life. So from there, I thought back to going to Japan. It was a country that I sort of had some familiarity with. And I started looking at PhD programs in Japan, and they're very, very eager to bring foreigners to Japan to work in academia. They want to try and internationalize academia across the board, not just in science and engineering or space. So they have very generous programs available to foreigners who want to come to Japan and do their PhD and sort of begin careers as researchers. So I sort of took advantage of that to do what I always wanted to do, which was work on rockets. And fortunately, Japan has a very large and, despite what they believe, very well-funded space agency, which has a program which works on reusable rocket engines. So JAXA has one of the JAXA research institutes is a collaboration between JAXA and universities in Japan. So you can sort of do your PhD or your master's degree while at the same time essentially working in the space agency, which was another big plus for me. So I took advantage of that opportunity to sort of work my way into JAXA and work on their research.
So I have, out of that, I've got a couple of different things. I'm excited to, and I'm gonna punt this question in the future, but I'm excited to ask you about Sabre because you said you were passionate about jet engines and rocket engines, and Sabre is a kind of a combination of those two. So we're gonna ask that a little bit later when we get into the reusable engines themselves, because I don't know how you get more reusable than that. But the other questions that came out of that were, I also want to touch on the JAXA reusable stuff because I personally hadn't heard of it before. I don't know if I'm just woefully out of date on that or if it's just like not well known. But before all of that, you also mentioned that you had always been interested in space, and you kind of really had this interest in propulsion. Can you talk about maybe, do you remember where that interest of space came from? Is there kind of a defining moment where you went, oh wow, yeah, this is definitely the field I want to be in?
Yeah, there was actually. Right back in elementary school, I had a very close friend who had a very strong interest in the same sort of thing. So space and aviation more generally. And I think it was right around the time that Apollo 13 came out, or maybe the time it came out on video or something. And I think he must have watched it dozens of times, and he'd come to school and tell me all about it. And so I guess my passion was sort of absorbed from him. And I mean, that was, over 20 years ago. We both went our separate ways. We're still in touch. And he's a pilot now. He's still got that passion to sort of be an astronaut. That's what we both wanted to be astronauts when we were kids. That was, I think, one of the typical childhood dreams. So he's very much still on that trajectory, but I've sort of realized that I'm afraid of heights. So going to space might be a bit of an issue.
Well, the ride to space, you might get scared, but then once you're in space, there are no heights anymore. So it's like the ultimate place for someone who's afraid of heights, because nothing's high, nothing's low.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true, actually. But I mean, even once you get in the rocket, I really love roller coasters, that sort of thing. Anything that's got that sort of high G-force. I love to put my body through that because I figure it's like exercising, but I don't have to work. But yeah, it's just climbing into the rocket. That first 20 or 30 meters would be the most terrifying.
I mean, depends on the size of the rocket. Might be more than that too. If you enjoy G-forces, as an aside, head over to Walt Disney World and jump on Mission Space in Epcot. That's a really good, it gives you feel like you're flying. You get 2.5 G's worth of force pressed against your body in a centrifuge. And it's just really well done. You'll probably enjoy that. So you got to make a trip over. Actually, everyone should make a trip over to Walt Disney World if you're a space geek and go on Mission Space. You may vomit afterwards, but it's worth it. All right, let's talk about, yeah, no, it really is. Let's talk a little bit about, you had mentioned JAXA has a reusable rocket program. I personally, I'm a terrible space geek. I'm not familiar with it at all. Can you tell me about what's going on over there? Because I know about Blue Origin, I know about SpaceX, I know about the smart reusability, I have to air quote smart reusability on Vulcan. But as far as I know, for active programs, that's about it right now. For large rockets. I'm not counting Dave Maston. I mean, he's all about reusable rockets.
Well, I mean, you can't really be blamed for not knowing about it. It is a very, I guess, by comparison to SpaceX in particular, it's a very small program. It's also a bit obscure. Even in Japan, it's not really that well known. Having said that, they've got a long track record. They started doing flight testing of vertical takeoff, vertical landing technology demonstrators way back in the 90s, late 90s. So a few years after DCX, which I think your viewers should be familiar with because you did an episode on it recently. A few years after that, Japan started a very similar program on a smaller scale. That was even before JAXA existed. So the predecessor organization to JAXA started this sort of a very small program to develop a subscale vertical takeoff, vertical landing rocket. Only went up to about 40 meters, I think, was the maximum altitude, and it would come back down and land. But the whole idea was, I guess, to learn the art of how a reusable rocket might work. So there was a lot of focus on operations as well as technology. So 24-hour turnaround, how do you achieve that? And what sort of effects do you have of a exhaust jet impinging upon landing legs and that sort of thing? So a lot of those basic technical questions and operational questions is what they were seeking to answer.
You said it was subscale.
So that program can.
You said a subscale. About how big was the subscale design?
Well, if you come to ISAS, JAXA in Japan, you can actually see it in the museum. It's not much bigger than an SUV, basically.
Okay.
So it stands probably 3 or 4 meters tall, and it's sort of a conical shape. So a lot like a crude capsule, but I guess a bit more pointy.
Well, a bit like the DCX then, right? It was kind of pointy.
Yeah, not that pointy.
Okay.
Somewhere between that and like an Apollo capsule sort of thing. Yeah. So that program lasted until the late 2000s, and they developed. And from where they started to where they finished, they started with a very basic pressure-fed engine, very aluminium tanks, that sort of thing, simple flight control software. And they built 4 different flight vehicles, and by the end, they had a much more advanced engine. They had an expander cycle engine. They had composite tanks. So there was a lot of. It was a small program, but they made a lot of progress. Unfortunately, and this goes back to why you may never have heard of it, there wasn't a lot of publications that came out of it. There wasn't a lot of press that came out of it. I'm not sure if that was accidental or deliberate. They have commercial partners who are basically holding a lot of the IP, which might have prevented publication of research and that sort of thing. But it's not very heavily promoted, even in Japan, like I said. So there's not a lot of knowledge about it. After that RVT program, they began working on a reusable sounding rocket, and they developed a new engine, which at the time was setting records for reusability, at least in terms of ground tests. I think they got over 100 flight cycle equivalent firings out of it in ground testing. But unfortunately, they never built the entire vehicle, but they took that engine and built and they're currently building this more subscale, another subscale launcher that's bigger than the RVT, but not as big as the sounding rocket they were going to build. And that's the RVX, which was on display at JAXA yesterday when they had an open day. And they're currently doing ground testing on that up in northern Japan. And I think they're going to start flight testing next year.
And when we're talking about, you said they really only kind of built like the engine, the thrust chamber kind of section of this. When we're talking about either reusable or refurbishable vehicles, is the engine the hardest part of this whole equation of getting all of this back, or is it just one piece of the puzzle?
Depends who you talk to, I guess. The flight control guys would probably say they've got the hardest job. I'm an engine guy, so I'd say it's the engine. But yeah, rocket engines generally are very difficult things to develop. And if you add the reusability requirement, which is not just, I guess, the ability to sort of restart the engine, it also encompasses things like long-term maintainability, deep throttling is obviously very important if you're doing propulsive landings. So that there's quite a few extra requirements that you have to layer on top that make it a lot more difficult. So I would say that, yeah, the engine is probably one of the harder parts.
We've been using the word reusable quite a bit, but there's actually something that we debate a lot here on Tomorrow is, are these vehicles reusable or refurbishable? For example, we consider the space shuttle not to be a reusable vehicle, but a refurbishable one. You would land it, you would take the whole thing apart. I'm oversimplifying, but you take it apart, you check all of the pieces, and you put it back together. That's not reusable. That's refurbishing it between every single flight. And if we're to reach a airline-like cadence of rockets going to space, you can't take the rocket apart every single time. So in your opinion, what is the line of demarcation in between what makes a rocket reusable or even an engine versus what makes it refurbishable?
I think part of the answer to that is what you mentioned in the question. I mean, the comparison is always made to aviation, to reaching commercial airline sort of levels of turnaround. And I guess there's arguments to be made that that's not a valid comparison, but I don't think you can dismiss it completely. In commercial aviation, they have different levels of maintenance checks. They start with what they call A level checks, which are very simple, not much more than a sort of walk around the aircraft, maybe open up a panel and check something or the other, not that detailed. And then they go right into what they call deep maintenance, or I think it's D level, so A, B, C, D. And D level checks are done every 5 years, I think. It's been a while since I worked in commercial aviation, so I might be getting some of this wrong. But a D level check is basically what they would do to the space shuttle after every flight. Sort of strip it down, check basically everything and rebuild it. So for the space shuttle, they sort of did that after every flight. For a commercial airliner, they would do that every 5 years. So they'd do it about 3 times over the life of the aircraft. So you can sort of see that difference in maintenance. In terms of what you would define as reusable, a lot of commercial airliners, if we stay on this analogy, short-haul commercial airliners will do multiple flights in a day with basically no maintenance in between. They'll reach a destination, they'll refuel, the pilot might do a walk around the aircraft to check for cracks or something, and they go again. And even with that basic level of maintenance, they've got an incredibly high safety record in the commercial aviation industry. So that would be the end goal. In terms of what, if you wanted to draw a line of demarcation, I guess, a common requirement that we see in studies here in JAXA is a 24-hour turnaround. So if you can land a rocket and do whatever maintenance check you need to do, and like I said, maintenance can be something very simple or it can be quite complicated, but if you can complete all of that, refuel the aircraft, the rocket, and fit the new payload or whatever it needs to do, if you can achieve that in a 24-hour period and launch again, then I would say that's, in the interim, that's the threshold for, I guess, what you would call reusability.
All right, so based on that, I'm going to play a fun game. This is a one-time, one and done game. We're calling refurbishable or reusable, and we've got a series of different rocket engines, and I would love to get your opinion as to whether that engine is refurbishable or reusable. Starting with, this looks like an RS-25. That was the Space Shuttle main engine. Refurbishable or reusable?
Based on your criteria, I think it's pretty clear it's refurbishable. Space Shuttle main engine had a design life of anywhere from 40 to 50 flights, depending on which documentation you read. But after each flight, it had some pretty deep maintenance done on it, and tragically, almost for the SLS, they're going to go right back to make it expendable, which is sort of. It's a very admired engine. A lot of the guys at JAXA look at this thing as one of the greatest rocket engines that's ever been developed for a variety of reasons. Now, you might agree or disagree with that, but it's very tragic to see something like that discarded after a single flight, because it's the antithesis of what it was developed for.
Yep.
But that's probably a digression. I would say reusable, but based on the requirements that you've outlined before, I think probably refurbishable.
Well, is it like, could you take an RS-25 and actually slam it on something that's not the space shuttle, right? Because we're only talking about the engine in this instance. We're not talking about necessarily its integration into the space shuttle. Do you believe they could take an RS-25, not on a space launch system, obviously, and put it on a different vehicle and just, based on your definition, turn it around in 24 hours? Or do you think they would have to actually take the whole thing apart between each mission?
I mean, it's a hard question to say yes or no on. I think it's about risk tolerance. If you're willing to say, well, I'm comfortable with a 10% chance of dying or explosion or whatever, it's probably okay.
It's pretty high chance.
But the more you do it, it's a continuum, right? So you could run it maybe one more time, fine. Try to run it 10 more times without maintenance, then you're probably pushing your luck. But I think it is a very well designed engine, and they had some minor, I don't want to call them failures, because the engine didn't fail, but they had some issues where, you know, they would come back and find some level of damage to the thrust chamber or to the turbo pumps or something, but the engine did its job, and it didn't have the level of health monitoring that we're looking at developing now, where, you know, you could have a engine control system that would detect faults as they were happening and engage an abort system. That level of computational power didn't exist when the space shuttle was flying. So I think it's pretty rugged. I think it's probably more rugged than it gets credit for.
Are you familiar with the STS-93 launch, where a gold pin essentially ripped through part of the engine and it still worked all the way up to orbit?
I wasn't familiar with the specific examples, but I remember reading reports, especially when I was starting out my thesis and looking at all these different reusable maintenance issues. I remember reading several reports of similar issues. I've seen photos of turbines that look like they'd been attacked by a dog, I guess, a dog with very strong teeth. I wasn't sure if that was from a flight or just from a ground test, but it seems like it can take a bit of punishment. But that sort of thing is very hard to verify unless you are, I guess, working on the program, you know. From my perspective, it looks...
I don't know if they're available on YouTube, but there is a amazing video of the Space Shuttle main engine testing prior to the first flight that happened in the 60s and 70s. If anyone in the chat room has it or can find it and can drop it in the comments, that would be amazing. Also, speaking of, would love your comments as to whether you believe each of these engines is refurbishable or reusable. Drop that in the comment, and why. Drop those in the comments below. Let's move to the next engine. It's the Merlin engine. This is from SpaceX. So this is what they're currently flying on their Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy. Reusable or refurbishable?
I am going to go out on a limb here and say I think that's reusable, even by the standard that we've established of a very fast turnaround with low maintenance.
You think they will turn a Falcon 9 in 24 hours?
I think they could if they wanted to. Maybe not yet, but and once again, this is all based on, I don't have any insider knowledge here, but comments that have been made by Elon Musk about, you know, we poked our head in the engine after a reflight and it looked pristine or something like that. So that's a very subjective analysis, but I think it's, once again, another amazing piece of technology. One of the key points of my PhD research was that there's probably a trade-off between reusability in terms of life, at least engine life, and performance. So if you want to extend the life, you're probably going to have to sacrifice some performance. One thing that's always amazed me about the Merlin is the performance is incredible. The thrust to weight that it can achieve is almost unheard of. At the same time, it's a reusable engine. So I don't know exactly how they've achieved the level of performance they have out of that engine, but once again, it is just something that is incredibly impressive.
Let's move to one of SpaceX's competitors in Blue Origin with the BE-3 engine, reusable or refurbishable.
I'll play this one a bit safer. I'm going to say that's refurbishable. Only because I don't know an incredible amount about it, and I guess if you're an engineer, you should try and be conservative about these sorts of things. So I don't know. I haven't been following what they publicly release about their maintenance of these engines and the turnaround times, but it's probably, yeah, I'm going to say refurbishable just because I don't want to say reusable without knowing too much about it, and that's the conservative answer. So.
Then let's move to the big brother, the Methalox variant. That was the Carolox engine. The Methalox variant is the BE-4 engine. How about that one?
Once again, not too familiar with it. Is this the one that they're going to use as they're supplying as a backup to ULA from one of their rockets.
Is it a backup? I think it's the primary now, isn't it? I think this is one of the primary.
Is it the primary?
engines.
Oh,
Yeah, I
okay.
think it's
Okay.
primary and
Well,
Vulcan. Yeah.
the rocket they want to use it on is expendable, and I feel like that should be there should be penalties for that in our analysis here. So yeah, let's penalize Jeff and let's say it's a refurbishable.
All right, back over to SpaceX. Their variation of the Methalox engine, the Raptor.
Oh, this is once again an impressive piece of technology. I don't want to make it look like I just realized that I'm praising the SpaceX engines and maybe talking down to the Blue Origin engines. That is definitely not intentional. I don't have a dog in this fight. But Raptor, probably too early to tell. Look, let's be even-handed here and say refurbishable. This is all very subjective. I'm getting quite uncomfortable.
Well, that's the goal of the show, to make our guests as uncomfortable as possible.
But yeah, once again, pretty impressive technology to have that full flow stage combustion. That's once again pretty big leaps in technology. So.
All right, I got a couple wacky engines here that I think will be fun, and I don't think people would normally think of when you think of reusable engines. The first is the XRS 2200. That is a linear aerospike engine, which also Raj Ruthra in the TMRO chat room asks, what are your thoughts on aerospike engines? So we'll kind of roll that all together, right? So here's a linear aerospike engine. Do you think that's reusable, refurbishable, and what do you think about aerospike engines?
Well, let me give a very basic answer here. The idea behind an aerospike engine, which once again you should be familiar with if you've been paying attention to your YouTube videos, is that you almost don't need one end of your exhaust nozzle, because you can sort of adjust using the atmospheric pressure. You can adjust the flow of the gas sort of naturally, so you don't need that extra wall there. So based on the fact that you don't need as many walls, I'm going to say that that's less maintenance. So let's call that reusable. In terms of what I think about it, I think it's a brilliant idea, but there is a lot of brilliant ideas in propulsion, in aerospace propulsion, that could probably work very well if they were funded. So if there's another billionaire who wants to throw their hat in the ring and try and get something like that working, then I think that'd be a great way to spend $1 billion. But I don't have $1 billion, so that's easy for me to say.
Would that be a game changer for reusable space? A working aerospike engine that doesn't have the weight and heat problem?
One of the issues I think that we have to remember when we talk about reusable operations is that even for a reusable launch vehicle, fuel is probably not a big cost in terms of the actual operations of the launch vehicle. So saving fuel is obviously important if it means that you can increase performance and increase payload capacity, but improving efficiency of these engines generally isn't necessarily going to give you a game-changing level of performance. I think if you could combine the aerospike nozzle with some other innovations, then you could change the game essentially. But you've got to you can't just rely on I guess that one trick. You know, you're going to have to be smarter than that.
I've got two engines left. These are the two that I'm most eager to get your opinions on. This first one is the RL10 engine. I feel like you've got a little bit of data behind that one. Reusable, refurbishable, and what do you think?
Let me continue to be subjective here and say the RL10 is completely reusable. I really like the RL10. Most of my early research was focused on the RL10 because it is a very old engine. Was first developed 50 or 60 years ago. There's been a lot of variants, but because it is so old and because NASA have had so much to do with its development over the years, there's quite a lot of publicly information available available information about this engine, which is not usually the case. I mean, companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin rightly keep their cards close to their chest. They're not sharing a lot of technical specifications, but there's a lot of detail out there if you want to go trawling through the NASA technical report server about the RL10 and about the nuts and bolts about how it works. And that made it a very good case for me to do detailed sort of cycle analysis modeling of the engine to test some of my reusability theories and performance theories. So I really like the RL10 just because it's played a part, I guess, in my own research. And not to be completely subjective, I mean, the RL10 was used in the DCX, which was, reusable testing. The grandfather of all these propulsive landing reusable rockets that we're seeing now is probably the DCX. So it played a part. It definitely played a part. And I feel like it deserves an honorary mention for that, even if it wasn't designed to be reusable.
We'll give it an honorary mention badge. But again, even if it's not designed to be reusable, doesn't mean it can't be reusable. If it just so happens that is a trait that it can inherit, then great, that it's reusable. I want to loop back around to some of your work, especially based off of what you did with the research you did on the RL10. But before we do that, one last engine, which I am curious about because it is a combination of a jet engine and a rocket engine slammed into one. And that is the Sabre engine, which will hopefully someday, I think they're only a decade out, fly on Skylon. What do you think? I don't have any real pictures of it. That's really all I could find. What do you think of the Sabre engine?
I would put the Sabre engine in the same category as the aerospike nozzle, right? So great idea if it can be funded. I think the difference between the aerospike and the Sabre is that it does have a much better, at least at the moment, seems to have a much better chance of getting the funding that they need to get it off the ground, both literally and figuratively. But this is incredibly impressive. The system that they use here for cooling intake air, that is essentially been seen as a hard limit on air-breathing engines for decades, or at least this type of air-breathing engine, that you can't take this any faster because basically the air gets too hot. And they've developed a way to sort of chill down that incoming air to an incredible extent. And that is very, very impressive. And that could really change the game, combined with some of the other innovations that they're working on for the Skylon spacecraft.
Do you think that's the bigger potential for supersonic flight as opposed to rocketry, or is it both, or neither?
In a technical sense, yes, you could use it for supersonic flight. Definitely. I mean, you could also do what Elon Musk talked about a few years ago, using Starship for suborbital point-to-point transportation. That's another option. You can sort of increase the speed dramatically of flying around the world. The question is, one, will people pay for it? And two, is there better ways to increase the speed of how you get around? So, for example, airports are not very efficient at moving people around, and you have to get to an airport a few hours before your flight and whatever else. So there's been arguments in the aviation community that if you want to make air travel faster, you start on the ground before you start thinking about supersonic travel. That's a very boring answer, but I can't help but be boring sometimes.
No,
it's part of being an engineer.
I would love for them to fix airports too. Like I don't. That absolutely needs to be fixed. Maybe we'll fix it when we build spaceports instead. All right. So all of these different rocket engines, potentially some that people didn't even think about, right? Like we've got all of this stuff, this great history of reusable, refurbishable rocket engines, and you're like, that is your area of expertise. You've studied this, you've looked at these engines, or some of them, whatever you're able to look at. What are some of the conclusions you've drawn based on the data that you have as to what would make these engines more reusable, or how can we make something turn, change Falcons to turn from, I don't know what the smallest gap is, but turn it into a 24-hour turn time?
So a thing that I've always believed, and I think has been confirmed by the results of my PhD research, is that for years and years and years, when we've talked about either increasing the performance of a rocket engine or any space technology, if you're talking about increasing performance or increasing reusability, the question has always been to make it stronger, to use better alloys, to redesign things to make them stronger and more powerful. I think there's a limit to that. The limit might always be increasing, but there's definitely a limit in terms of what you can achieve, making things more powerful, making things stronger, making them better able to withstand whatever punishment we throw at them. I think to an extent we have to sort of take a step back and say, well, rather than trying to make these things as strong as possible, which is important, maybe one of the keys to extending the life of reusable rocket engines is to reduce the severity of the conditions that they're exposed to. So that's definitely a theme of my research. It's also key to probably, I imagine, what SpaceX are trying to do with the Raptor. So they're more focused on turbo machinery, I guess, in this instance. If you use a full flow stage combustion cycle, you can reduce the load on your turbines, which are very important components in terms of life and reusability. I'm more focused on the thrust chamber, but once again, if you can reduce the severity of the conditions and the loads to which it's subjected, you can increase the life as well. So I think it's not just a question of making a sort of an unobtainium, ridiculously powerful and strong engine that can withstand anything. It's also a question of, well, let's not wring its neck quite as much as we might otherwise.
You said you focused on the thrust chamber. What specifically in the thrust chamber have you focused on, and what are some of the techniques rocket manufacturers or engine manufacturers can use to extend the life of their reusable engines?
So I'm not sure how familiar your users are with thrust chambers, but for regeneratively cooled thrust chambers, essentially you have the core where the combustion happens and the exhaust nozzle, and then around the edges of that you have some sort of coolant that's pumped through these very small channels in the walls. Usually the coolant is fuel. So fuels like hydrogen work very well for that because they can absorb a lot of heat. So what that does is you have on one side this coolant, which is very cold, and on the other side, combustion gases, which are very hot. And the separation between them is millimeters. It's tiny. So you've got a huge temperature difference in a very small space. And that temperature difference causes thermal strains. It causes the walls to sort of bulge inwards and sort of rupture. So to prevent that from happening, you want to try and reduce that temperature difference as much as possible. So it's probably a bit counterintuitive, but if you want to extend the life, I think one of the important things to do is reduce the coolant flow rate as much as you can. So you might think that you want to pump as much coolant in there as possible to cool down the walls as much as possible, but the more coolant you those cooling channels, then that you're increasing that temperature difference, which is probably the most important thing in terms of extending the life. But having said that, you can't have no coolant running through them because that would introduce another failure mechanism, which we call creep, which is essentially if your alloy reaches a certain threshold temperature, then it will start to fail very quickly. So to avoid that, you need some coolant, but you need to minimize the amount of coolant that you're pumping through that just to stop that failure, to stop that temperature difference from getting too high. So it's a little bit counterintuitive in that sense.
It does make some sense. It's just, I feel like as an engineer, I'd be like, no, I want to keep that cold because I don't want to burn through on my nozzle. and the cooler you make it, the less chance you would have of it. But to your point, you want the differential between the really cold and the really hot to be as small as possible, which also works against these cryogenic fuels, right? The part of what these companies are doing is working on making these the fuels and oxidizers as cold as possible, so they can cram as much on the vehicle as they can in a limited amount of space. And then, of course, that super cold liquid is going to flow through the nozzle, creating that larger gap. Could they just warm it up before they move it?
Well, it's in terms of the critical failure point, it's usually at the throat of the nozzle.
Sure.
Okay, so there are ways around that. If you start pumping, say, from the top of the nozzle in the combustion chamber, and you sort of run that fuel through along the edges of the combustion chamber first, then it heats up quite a bit in the combustion chamber where the failures aren't going to happen. Mm-hmm. And then by the time it gets to the throat, it's a lot warmer. So there are workarounds for that, and you can sort of increase that temperature. The problem is, the more you increase the temperature, the less heat you can remove. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? You want to remove heat, but you don't want the temperature difference to be that high.
Also, the temperature at the throat is crazy. Like, that's the part where everything in the engine is focused. So,
yeah,
I mean, it feels like that's the part where I want to remove the most amount of heat.
Yeah, and it definitely is. One of the interesting outcomes of my research was that the throat is often considered the critical failure point because it's the point where you have the highest rate of heat transfer, the highest rate of heat flux. But heat flux in and of itself is not something that will cause a metal to fail or cause an alloy to fail. Temperatures can play a part. Definitely thermal strains can do it. If you've got a high temperature on one side and a low temperature on the other, that can cause failure. But just the physical process of running a lot of energy through a lot of heat energy through a wall is not going to cause failure. It's the temperatures of the problem, not the heat flux. So what I found was reducing the heat flux in the throat is not so much of an issue, and it's not necessarily going to cause a failure at the throat. If there's geometry changes just forward or after the throat, then you could have failures in those points as well. So there's been, for 50 years, the focus has always been on the throat, but maybe it's not always the throat that we need to be focused on. That was a sort of not an expected result of my research, but something that we found was that failures may occur not at the throat based on the geometry as well. So geometry is another thing that we need to consider.
So we've used the same geometry of our throat and skirt of most of the combustion chamber for decades now. Is there low-hanging fruit there of like simple tweaks to that, just the basic shapes that we could do as well? And I'm going to tack onto that with a question from the comments when you're done there.
So when I say geometry, sorry, I should have been more clear. The sort of converging, diverging nozzle geometry, the fundamental geometry that we've been using is pretty standard, and I don't think that can really change that much unless you look at something like an aerospike. The geometry that I'm talking about is inside the wall itself. So how thick do these walls need to be? And how many of these cooling channels do you put around the edge? And that affects the thickness of the cooling channels and the ribs and how high they need to be, those dimensions inside the wall itself. So once again, this is a bit counterintuitive, but a thick wall increases the temperature difference. So you'd think a thick wall is better because it's stronger, and it is stronger. But if you have a bigger temperature difference, then your thermal strains increase, and you're going to get temperature-induced failures. So you almost want the wall to be as thin as possible. Once again, though, it's a double-edged sword. If you make the wall too thin, then it can fail, from the pressure difference, for example. So you want a thin wall so that you can remove as much of that heat as possible and keep the temperature difference low. But you want a thick wall because a thick wall would be stronger. So that's what I mean, I guess, of the challenges of geometry. And quite a few of these engines have variable geometry. So the wall thickness is not the same all the way through the engine. The wall thickness changes. And based on that changing wall thickness, you can get changes in where we predict the failure will happen. It won't fail exactly at the throat. It'll fail forward of the throat, just forward of the throat, or just after the throat, or something like that. So the geometry of the cooling channels, I think, is very important.
That leads me brilliantly into a question from our chat room from Prodigal Son, who asks, what about a dual wall between the two temperature differentials?
A dual wall.
So I think kind of almost, yeah, like I'll call it an air gap for lack of a better term. I don't know that you want actual air there, but
it's an interesting idea, and there has been a few different designs for thrust chamber walls, which include things like fins and this sort of stuff, cooling fins, which the coolant can flow around. A dual wall could work. The problem is that, once again, you're going to have a temperature difference within the wall. So if you've got some sort of gap, then you're going to have a temperature difference on the two sides of the gap and then the other two sides of the gap. So it's really difficult to solve that problem. There has been quite a few suggested ideas. At one of the NASA centers, I think it was Glenn, which has now been renamed, I'm not sure. But all the reports that I was looking at in my thesis were from the 80s and the 90s. So they're probably a bit dated. But there was a whole bunch of sort of recommendations for research and development into how to extend the life of a thrust chamber by redesigning it. And one of the suggestions was to actually make the outer wall, so the wall on the other side of the cooling channel, deliberately make it from a more ductile, softer alloy, because that will allow that part of the wall to sort of deform more and absorb the changes, like whatever strains are happening in the inner wall from the temperature difference can sort of be absorbed by the outer wall. So it's like almost like a sponge, a structural sponge, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And you can prevent, or you can mitigate failures by using that softer metal to permit deformation without the inner wall deflecting too much.
That also leads brilliantly into another question from our chat room from Juggling Lessons, who asks, does 3D print change, in other words, 3D printers, now that we can do new shapes and forms that we maybe couldn't do before, does that change the cooling channels enough to change the limits of the heat flux? Because now you can build whatever shape inside of that you wanted that you maybe couldn't have formed before.
It is an interesting question. I think, and obviously some companies are looking at this. Virgin Galactic in particular has a very strong focus on 3D printing a lot of rocket engine components. I'm not an expert in 3D printing. I always had this image that if you 3D printed a metal component, then on a microscopic level, you're sort of creating these inconsistencies in the structure as you sort of lay down every layer of material, which would, I thought, would reduce the strength. But I've been assured by people who work on metal 3D printing that that's not the case, and they can achieve the same sort of strengths and failure rates that you'd achieve from a non-3D printed metal. So that's not a concern. It's definitely difficult to machine thrust chambers. It's not impossible to machine the sort of shapes that we want, but it is difficult. So I think 3D printing might make it cheaper, but I can't off the top of my head think of a shape of cooling channel that we want to make that we can't make already. It's just a little bit expensive to do that sort of machining.
Back to the chat room, Lisa Stojanovsky, right here from Tomorrow, asks, what about using fuel films around the walls to help cool by changing the oxidizer-fuel mixture ratio? What
a brilliant question. That is actually something that is done pretty commonly in rocket engines. It's called film cooling. So the idea is that you introduce on the edges of the combustion chamber. So if you imagine this is the looking down the throat. This is the edges of the combustion chamber. Right around the edges, we either have different designs of injectors, or we have specific injectors which just inject fuel or oxidizer to create this buffer zone between the wall and the combustion products. And so, like Lisa says, that would reduce the local oxidizer to fuel ratio, which would essentially stave off combustion in those areas, which is kind of what you want, because if the combustion reaction happens too close to the wall, you're introducing a lot of energy, which will manifest as heat where you don't want it, which is near the walls. You can also absorb heat if you inject that propellant, whether it's fuel or oxidizer. If you inject it as a liquid, then you have the phase change will absorb some energy as well, will absorb some of that heat. So you can use that as well as sort of like an insulation, a gas insulation. So there is a lot of advantages to film cooling. There are some technical challenges. I wouldn't call that a disadvantage because it is used so commonly, even in expendable engines, that I don't think it's really that difficult to implement. I've seen some research that argues that film cooling can reduce your performance, specifically specific impulse, because it creates this zone of low speed gas. Now, if you're familiar with fluid mechanics, you'll know that any flow along a wall has a boundary layer already where the flow of the fluid, whether it's a liquid or a gas, is already slower. But if you introduce film cooling, then you're exacerbating that problem because you're deliberately creating an area where there's less energy, essentially, in the gas. And if you have a lower local velocity, that means your average exhaust velocity is going to go down, and you want a high exhaust velocity because that gives you high specific impulse. So I've seen that argument. I haven't seen a lot of data to support it, though.
Let's go backwards one step. You kind of touched on this earlier, and there's a comment in the chat room from Trey Harmon talking about material sciences and alloys. And the question is, how much potential is there for breakthrough in material science with new alloys to improve greater performance? Now, you mentioned unobtainium, like there's this kind of always looking for the next great material that will dissipate 100% of heat and has no issues whatsoever and weighs nothing. But how, lithium-ion batteries have a 7% improvement year over year. Is there any sort of improvement, tacking on to that question year over year to material sciences or different alloys that will allow us to maybe get a little bit more out of the engine without having to take the performance back, say, 5%?
Look, let me qualify my answer by saying I'm not a materials engineer. And I do remember having a professor, a materials engineering professor, who always made this argument that basically the progress of humanity in a very general sense is always measured by how well we can make materials. And he always used to talk about, we had the Stone Age, and then we had the Iron Age, and we had the Bronze Age. So, I mean, pushing his own barrow, but he sort of made this argument that material science is always the limiting factor on any engineering problem, which is probably not true, but it is important. In terms of material improvements, the reason I think that you see these improvements in lithium-ion batteries is because there's a lot of investment and there's a lot of motivation to improve the performance of batteries. I don't know if there's the same level of investment in high-temperature alloys. There might have been at one stage, but probably not at the moment. On the scientific side, something that's always impressed me looking at materials data for thrust chambers was that copper is a very common material to use, right? Because it's got a very high thermal conductivity, so it's very good at removing heat. But it's also very weak. I mean, you can, if you have, a copper pipe in your hands, you can almost bend it, or you can bend it if it's thin enough, because it's an incredibly ductile, weak metal on its own. But if you alloy it, so if you introduce different alloys, you can increase the strength incredibly without really losing any thermal conductivity. So that's something that really impressed me, because I was always of the impression that there were these trade-offs to have in material science and alloys and this sort of thing. So if you want to increase something, you're going to lose something somewhere else. But at least in the case of copper alloys, the specific sort of alloys that you might see used in thrust chambers, you can achieve very high thermal conductivity without losing any structural. You can achieve very high strength without losing any thermal conductivity. The problem is, I think that low-hanging fruit has already been taken. So if we're talking about future improvements, I'm not sure how to build on that, I guess.
So before we go into kind of the ending non-rocket parts of the show, much earlier we actually talked about your PhD, and you had mentioned that you had a story, and I'm not actually sure we got to the story about your PhD, and I just wanted to make sure we did touch on that. And if not, if you could tell your PhD, because I don't want to promise something and then not deliver on it.
So I think you mentioned, I'm not sure if we were live at that point, but you said something along the lines of, there's probably this trade-off between performance and reliability, but at the end of the day, performance is what matters, or something to that effect.
Sure, yeah. Seems like something I would say.
And that brief statement sort of brought back some painful memories of the last few months of my PhD, where I had spent years talking to my supervisor, telling and having these discussions about we need to quantify this trade-off. If we reduce performance this much, how much of an increase in life can we achieve for the thrust chamber specifically? And he was on board with that, I thought he was. And there's always communication issues when I'm a foreigner in Japan, he's a Japanese guy, and we're talking whether we're using English or Japanese. There's always some barriers to understanding. And in the last few months of my PhD, he started saying, well, there might be a trade-off in performance, but you've got to realize that for any given flight vehicle, there's a thrust requirement. There's a specific value thrust requirement, and there's usually a minimum specific impulse. So if you go higher than that, it's not a problem, but there's a minimum. So he said, your argument about, there being a trade-off here is interesting, but in a practical sense, it's useless because no one's going to want to sacrifice thrust or specific impulse to extend life. So my entire thesis really went from being an argument of we need to sacrifice performance for life, and quantifying that equation to how can we optimize the life of a thrust chamber without sacrificing performance.
But wait a minute.
When he started to say that, I got very worried because it was in the last few months before my submission deadline, and it seemed like we were taking a very different tack, and I was worried about, are we going to achieve this in the time that we have? Fortunately, we did get I could use a lot of the data that I'd already collected to perform optimizations and that sort of thing, multivariable optimizations, to get him the answer that he wanted to hear. It was a bit daunting, I guess, a bit scary at the time to hear that sort of.
It does sound
discussion.
terrifying. However, isn't that kind of the tact? I feel like your view is SpaceX and Elon Musk back in the Falcon 1 days, and his view is United Launch Alliance back in the Falcon 1 days of no, you don't want to give up any performance. You need all of the performance always. That's why all rockets are expendable. They will always be expendable. Reusability is stupid. And then you've got Elon come in and go, no. You can give up some performance as long as you can get your payload to space. Get your rocket back. Bring the cost of space down. It feels like you were arguing more for that of no, take some of the performance out. As long as you have enough to do what you need to do, you're fine. But get some of that life back in the rocket. Bring the cost of space down. Is that an oversimplification of it?
I would say it more like, I don't want to disparage my supervisor because he's, I've got a lot of respect for him. The thing I would say is he has been doing reusability research since way before it was cool. So in that sense, he is very much a hipster. But he's also a systems engineer. So he thinks about the entire launch vehicle. And with any big engineering project, whether it's a rocket or a bridge or anything, when you've got multiple sub-disciplines of engineering work together, multiple teams, it's political. It's managing everyone's expectations, and requirements are a big part of that. So if you've got a propulsion guy who's saying, like if we take a 10% performance hit, then we can extend life. You might have a payload engineer who's saying, well, I don't want to take that performance hit. Like I want to achieve this minimum payload. So it was more about looking at higher level requirements, and as an engineer, you're always trying to meet the higher level requirements. You can't really take your own bowl and run with it and say, well, this is acceptable for me, so it's acceptable for the entire system, it's acceptable for the entire team. So I think that was more of his argument. And to be fair, I mean, when he first started saying that, I was very worried, mostly about the time. I was thinking if I had another year, I could do a lot more analysis of this, but I don't have a year. I've only got a few months. But it's amazing what people can achieve when they're under pressure. And we got some data that sort of proved his point. And in the end, I'm trying to think exactly what the number was. I think we worked out that we could extend life by 24%, I think the number was. So increase the flight cycles to failure essentially by about 24% without losing any thrust or specific impulse. So he had a point.
I mean, that's a huge win just in general.
Yeah. I mean, well, it's less than optimizing, just optimizing reusability and saying, well, you can take a performance hit. I think it's about half of what you could achieve if you were willing to take a performance hit, which is admittedly not a big performance hit, but it is a performance hit.
I assume it's a sliding scale, right? So you can kind of choose to take like no performance hit, but you don't get as much reusability back, or you can move that all the way over and you take a huge performance hit, but you get a ton of reusability. Can you kind of go in the middle as well and go, well, I want to optimize here? So then it ultimately just becomes an engineering trade.
Yeah, pretty much. There are multiple operating conditions that you can control, and that's how you achieve the optimization of extending life without losing performance. So you change one thing and then you compensate that by changing something else. So that's how we achieve that optimization. But yeah, it is essentially a scale of how much you're trying to extend life and how much of a performance hit you can take to do that.
Let's change gears a little bit and get into the kind of the ending, winding down part of the interview and talk awkward stuff. I have random notes from Lisa with no context whatsoever, so I don't actually know what I'm asking. The first note she had was, and I don't know if I'll pronounce this right, it's Vili dogs, V-I-L-I dogs, but that's all she said. So I'm just going to say those words to you and go, what does that mean?
Well, to me, it's a very important part of my culture. To Lisa, it's a joke. So you guys are in the US.
Yes.
I guess most of your viewers are in the US.
It's actually less than 50%.
Okay, less than 50%. So, well, regardless, I guess it's not a majority of Australians. So I don't know if the term bogan means anything to you.
Not to me.
Bogan? No. The closest comparison you could make in American culture, I think, would be redneck.
Okay, yep, there you go. Okay, yep.
It's not exactly the same. People will say, oh, bogan is an Australian redneck, but it's not. They're not the same thing. But basically, that's my background. I've suppressed it a lot, got a PhD and, moved overseas and became very international, but that's my roots. And a Vili dog is bogan food. It's essentially a hot dog that's wrapped in pastry.
That sounds delightful.
So it is. It's great. But a lot of people will eat it and say, well, this is garbage, because it's a very cheap hot dog wrapped in very cheap pastry.
I feel like if I had known, we would have had some and we would have eaten some at the end of the show. That would have been an amazing way to close the show.
They're hard to find because Vili is the company that makes them. So there's only one company that makes them. And you can't get them here in Japan. So I try to make them myself. The problem that I found is the sausages that you use, the hot dogs, and the pastry that you get in Japan. Like everything in Japan is high quality, really nice stuff. And when you put that together and you make this Vili dog, it looks right, but then when you bite into it, you're like, this tastes almost too good. Like this doesn't taste like garbage. So
Oh man,
it's
What-
not real.
That and fairy
But-
bread. I disagree with Australians on fairy bread as well, because Lisa treated us to that, and I'm like, no, this is just bad. Does
Oh
that?
no, this is not an Australian thing. This is a me thing. Most
love-
Australians will say you're an idiot. But,
I love that Lisa's
I don't
giving me
know.
a hard time. She's like, you weren't supposed to take those notes seriously. Oh, I'm taking them seriously, and we're continuing, because I believe that leads into the Farmers Union iced coffee, because it's still a food
Yeah.
thing, right? Same. What's happening is Lisa's giving you a hard time over your diet, I think is what's happening.
Oh, she's giving me a hard time over my former diet. I would just like to point out that since I started my PhD, I've lost about 30 kilos, which is what, 50 pounds or something like that.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, I was a big boy. I was a big boy, and I'm not anymore. Well, I'm still not as big.
I hope hopefully that was a healthy loss and not just a stress loss.
Oh no. It was very much a focused, targeted goal of getting old and realizing that I have to improve my lifestyle. But so you mentioned iced coffee.
Yes.
Farmers Union iced coffee, specifically, I think is what Lisa is referring to.
Mm-hmm.
So both Villy Dogs and Farmers Union iced coffee are from South Australia, which is where I'm originally from. They're sort of local foods. And the interesting thing I think about Farmers Union, when we say iced coffee in Australia, that's like coffee with milk. So like an iced cafe latte or an iced cafe au lait or something like that.
Okay.
That's what they call it in Japan. I'm not sure what they call it in other countries.
No, that works. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But it's very sweet as well. And in every state of Australia, and I think most countries around the world, the most popular beverage product, I guess, is basically Coca-Cola. I think in some Middle Eastern countries it might be Pepsi or something like that, but it's basically cola or soda. And one glaring exception to that is South Australia, where the most popular drink is iced coffee, because we have Farmers Union iced coffee, which once again, as a bogan, I think is sort of manna from heaven. But anyone else who drinks it, especially coffee aficionados, if you think you're missing out on some sort of, single origin bean, Lima poop coffee or whatever it is, you're not. But as like I said, it's the taste of home for me. So.
The brilliant thing about that is in our producer's control room right now is my wife, who is the head barista for the coffee at SpaceX. So
really?
She needs to try this now. It is a requirement. If they make it in decaf, that needs to be a thing. She just said Lima poop. Well, I'm sure it showed up at the bottom of the screen. Lima poop coffee is good. All right.
I'm sure I'm not. I can't remember what they call that, but it's probably not Limas.
No, but if anything, any poop coffee is gross, right? I mean, it's just gross. Really closing out, I got two last things to close out with. One is, where can people read up on your work or learn more about you and what you're working on with regards to reusable rocket engines?
So, despite her hostility to my diet and my culture, Lisa is a very good friend of mine, and she has very recently helped me set up a Twitter account. I'm very much of an engineering professor in the traditional sense when it comes to technology like this. I know a lot about reusable rocket engines, but I can't work a slide projector or something like that. And so I didn't have a Twitter account until very recently. So I've just started a Twitter account, and it's at Matt Janier. So as in engineer, but with the EN gone and Matt instead. So at Matt Janier, you can find me there. And like I said, it's a brand new, fresh account. So you can get in on the ground floor, I guess. Part of what I'm hoping to do there is not only talk about my own work and my research, but also promote what's happening in Japan more generally, which might not sort of get out into the English-speaking world because of language barriers. So I'm hoping to sort of promote a bit of, I guess, Japanese space and science and technology news more generally. So if that's something that interests you, please go and follow me on Twitter. And that's all I have at the moment, I guess.
I have to
I'm
give
still
Lisa-
working on this social media presence.
I was gonna give you a hard time at the top of the show because I won't give out the whole thing, but your email address came from Hotmail, and in our guest form, there's no it says what's your social media, and it said not applicable, and I'd never seen that before, and I was gonna ask you how your MySpace page was going, but I decided not to do that at the last minute. Now I feel like I should have done that. That would have been funny. All right, so. The very last thing I'd like to close the show out on. You said you mentioned Lisa. Can you tell us any embarrassing stories about Lisa? Because you both went to ISU together in 2016. Like the most embarrassing story possible. I'm sure in 1 minute, because there's a 1 minute delay, she's going to yell at me something fierce in the chat room, and it'll be too late because the story will have already made it to air.
So fortunately for Lisa, my memory's not the best. I'm sure there are embarrassing stories about Lisa, but even if I could remember them, in those situations, I was probably being even more embarrassing. So, I mean, in the interest of mutually assured destruction, I guess I'll stay too far away from that. I will say that despite her enthusiasm, she's not the best dancer.
That is a brilliant place to end this show. Matt, I know it is like 4 o'clock in the morning for you. You've been up for a while. You've been a really huge trooper. We were going to have a little coffee thing on the bottom. Anytime you had more coffee, we're going to update that. And really seriously, your amazing mug.
A little icon there.
We did it. We showed your mug in pre-show. Before we go, you want to show it one more time so it makes it into the archive? Because it's a JAXA mug or just a Japan of all the different rockets?
This mug says the history of Japanese rockets, or the history of Japanese rocketry, depending on how you translate it. So it starts on one side of the handle here. The little sounding rockets they developed in the 70s, and then as you sort of go around the edge of the mug, you can see the more and more recent rockets. Most of the interesting stuff's at the back here. So this one that I'm pointing to, that's the M5 that was used to launch the first Hayabusa, and then you can see H1, H2, H2A and B, Epsilon, which is their little solid rocket launcher. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out which way to go around. And then finally H3, which is sort of listed here as the year is 20XX. So they left themselves a bit of breathing room there in terms of delays, I guess.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you. I know it's very, very early, so we're going to let you go. I appreciate you spending the time on a Saturday to come on the show. It was a delight, and hopefully people will follow you at Matt Janier on Twitter. It was absolutely fantastic having you here.
Thanks, Jamie. It's been a lot of fun.
All right, and before we go, I also want to thank everyone who helped to make this show happen. These are our Escape Velocity citizens. Just so everyone knows, I process these at the beginning of the month, so we get new slates at the beginning of each month. However, because we're at the very, very beginning of the month and credit cards are still being processed, I couldn't do them today. So if your name's not on the slate and you just became a new member on YouTube or a new patron on Patreon, just give it one more week and your name will show up here. Everyone here helps contribute to these shows and make these shows happen. We've got our news show, we've got our live interview shows like this, and we've got letting off steam shows, which are a great deal of fun. We couldn't do these shows without your help. We don't have ad sponsorship. We don't have anything like that. YouTube sometimes runs ads in our shows, but YouTube gets most of the revenue from that, not us. And so your willingness to contribute to the shows allows us to quite literally keep the lights on and keep us in orbit, I guess. So thank you, truly, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you, every single person inside of those slates. We are focusing on YouTube right now. So if you do want to become a member, head on over to youtube.com/TMRO/join. And you've got all the same memberships that you had over on Patreon. Patreon's not going to go anywhere, but we think that YouTube is a better future for us. It's got more options and just cooler stuff that they can do. And it's integrated into the chat, so I can actually see if you're a member up on my cool little chat screen over here. So I really do appreciate that. There will be most likely no space news this week because Jared is out and I'm busy trying to launch some rockets and stuff. So until next time, as Jared would say, keep exploring. James Johnson says ads suck. Chris Radcliffe, here we go, hang on. Tomorrow citizenship, it's worth it. Matt, you've been up an obscene amount of time. It's hard for us to hang up the call, but like you should either go back to bed or go get some more, what was it, the coffee? It was, I don't have it in my notes anymore.
Farmers Union, not the poop one.
Yeah, Farmers Union iced coffee. I feel like that is what you should go do right now. I don't want to keep you any longer, but I did want to thank you again for being up so absurdly early. We really do appreciate it. I hope you had fun and got to geek out. No.
No. This was terrible. No, it was a lot of fun. Are we still live? Or?
We are still live. Yeah, the world can still see us.
Okay.
But this won't make it into the official archive.
Okay.
So you can make fun of me. You can make more fun of Lisa because it won't make it into the official archive. So if you have better stories.
No. Honestly, I wish I did. But I feel like I've dug enough of a hole for myself. So
no, the dancing comment was brilliant. I loved it. All right. Thank you so much. We'll let you go from there. I'll just hang out with the community for a little bit while longer with some chat stuff. And unless there's anything else you had questions for us, you have a great rest of your day.
You too. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Toodles.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you again sometime.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, we should bring him back. Let's see here. I enjoyed the interview. It's tough for me because I haven't been in the interview chair for a little while, so I'm a little bit rusty. I feel like I kind of got my stride near the end where I kind of was laughing and having fun, but I was actually fundamentally just really interested in what he was saying, and so I was so focused on reusable engines that I felt like I was more serious than normal. But I did enjoy the last segment. I thought that was, like, I enjoyed the whole thing. But I really enjoyed the last segment. I thought that was fun. I would assume that the rocket engineers think the last segment was the worst one, but not that you guys know where the segment markers are in the show. Loopy Dragon says, I want to bring up something from early on in the show. Aerojet Rocketdyne fired a Space Shuttle main engine 10 times in 10 days for the Phantom Express. Well, I think based on the classification that we outlined in the episode of once every 24 hours, right? That would qualify, assuming we're not talking about the whole launch vehicle, assuming it's just the engine, that would qualify. Does that feel like, I feel like the SSME could, the RS-25 could be reusable, not refurbishable.
I feel like that, like Matt said, it's how much risk you're willing to accept.
But we can't be there.
Because for the shuttle program, they strove really hard to accept very little risk, which I think is why they went through the process of disassembling the engines after every flight. But if I'm not mistaken, on most of them, they found nothing wrong.
I think they had quite a few issues with turbopumps throughout
there's always issues, but once you understand what those issues are, you can certainly apply engineering and materials to be able to solve those and resolve those. What I think they're finding now is that they're trying to wring so much out of them. So it's like the difference between a Ford Focus and a Ferrari. The Ford Focus's engine is going to go for 200,000 miles if all you do is change oil. But the Ferrari, you have to change oil every 2,000, 3,000 miles or whatever, and then every 5,000 you need to. It's more maintenance. It's more intense because you're asking so much more of it.
Well, I think there is a third option you're not considering, which is I'm going to go ahead and get a Model S with ludicrous speed, which means I don't have to change the oil at all, and it will still go 200,000 miles an hour. I'm glad I did that post-show.
That's the Plaid model, not
that.
ludicrous.
Yeah, apparently. It's 0 to 200,000 in 60 seconds, in 6 seconds. What, like the G-forces alone would crush your bones, right?
It'd just liquefy you.
You would insta liquefy. So hopefully the 4K actually worked this week. I'll go back and check the archives and see how well that is. I'm not sure that I liked the extra latency. In fact, I definitely did not like the extra latency. I was not okay with it. So we're going to next week pull that back. We'll move either to 1440 or 1080 because I don't think, in my opinion, that wasn't worth it, unless there just wasn't a whole lot in the room. Like, was everyone quiet? Yeah? Were they listening? Were there side conversations, or was I just boring? Yeah. You guys can't hear Carrie Ann, so you don't know how they answered. You'll never know. How on earth can I cross my legs so tightly? I think it's an optical illusion. You're hitting the camera from a like this is crossed under. It's not as tight as you think. There's giggling from the control room now, so I can only imagine. Chris actually has an interesting comment, which says, "Sounds like the split between reusable and refurbishable will be shown in operation, not in design." I think that's a really insightful comment. And ultimately, if we're looking at the whole cohesive vehicle, because you can't just look at the engine, right? Because if you have reusable engines and a refurbishable rocket, you still have a refurbishable platform. So you have to look at the entire platform, top to bottom, not just the rocket, but the other thing that a lot of people forget about are the ground systems. Like when you launch off of that pad, that's a giant cone of fire with a lot of force behind it. And it wants to obliterate anything that's not welded down tightly. So, or anything that's even slightly melty. So making sure that your ground operations are able to also turn from a similar or same location within 24 hours, I would argue is just as much of a challenge as getting the rocket to turn in 24 hours. And in some cases, maybe more of a challenge, depending upon a few variables. So it's always depending. Yeah, Lisa said, I hated the lag, made it hard. Yeah, I don't feel like the lag was worth the 4K. Unless you guys disagree, I don't feel it was worth it. Colton said it's sub-second here for me. Well, that's because Colton's on the... by the way, for those who are citizens, you actually have the lowest possible latency stream that YouTube offers. So if you want like super, I think it's around 2 to 4 seconds of latency from glass to your screen. On the YouTube membership area, just go to our community tab and you'll actually see the video there. It's pretty awesome. This one, Manosan says, Ben is looking increasingly healthy and fit. I'll take it. Theron says, yay, ground support. Let's see here. Loopy Dragon says the RL10 is a reusable design. Spark igniters don't require any consumable ignition fluid like Merlin's do. I would argue that consumables don't make it reusable or refurbishable. Also, I would argue that something like TTEB helps guarantee ignition as opposed to sparklers that sometimes they go, sometimes they don't. And those moments when they don't can be a really bad day for your rocket. You guys get me for another 5 minutes or so. That seem about legit, control room? Cool. I see Carrie Ann yawning in the background. A couple other notes just related to tomorrow in general. I am working on changing our reward levels imminently. And so you're going to get different perks for your membership to tomorrow, including access to our control room, audio feeds. I don't know that I'm going to do the V-Link. I think I'm going to remove that as a perk because I just don't know that that works like I want it to, undecided. But you can also get, like we're about to go into a post-show meeting where we all kind of sit around a table, talk about how it went. If you're currently an Escape Velocity citizen and you're in our Discord room, you can head on over. You can actually listen to that today in post-show, and that will also be a future reward that is coming out very, very soon. So watch for those. Watch for an update on the things that you get. I'm working on getting everyone a lot more behind-the-scenes access to how all of the what is it? How the beef is made? How the what is made?
The Villy dogs.
How the Villy dogs are made. You're gonna get all of the. Well done, well done. Where'd we get a giggity from? Oh, Sarah. Sarah gave me a giggity. Thanks. She doesn't have a microphone, but Prodigal Son asks, what is Carrie Ann's view on masala chai latte?
I can't have the caffeine anyway, so
That's true. She can't have caffeine. So She's a barista that can't have caffeine, but they do make decaf coffee, so. Noting a 42-second. This isn't worth it. This isn't worth. Hopefully everyone enjoyed 4K, but no, who cares? Like, 1080p is fine. I'll take 1080p at the lower latency. We tried it. We understand. We know. Again, sometimes I try things on this channel for other things that I do throughout my life, and so I'm testing things out just to see how they go. It was actually, I would argue, a successful test, right? Everyone had a stream. It did actually work. So I got that part of it down. I just need to figure some other stuff out. My nails are looking terribly on point. Hang on, give me that. I don't understand how what is making them look on point. But there you go. Those are my nails. Man of Sand, who will likely get to the moon first, SpaceX or the new national team led by Blue Origin? SpaceX. Anyone disagree? No. No one in the control room I can't see Detta, but I assume you don't disagree? No, he doesn't disagree. Everyone in the control room and out here on the observation lounge thinks it's SpaceX. I didn't even have to. Helpdesk 360p is good enough. Yeah, no, exactly. Like, I think 4K will be cool for other certain things where latency and interactivity doesn't matter, but for a show with interactivity, it's not worth the latency. I'll take the resolution hit, not the latency hit. I think is something. Jamie, it means that they're looking good. Thanks. I'm not hip with all of the terms from all you youths. All you youths. The Drunk Rocketeer, that sounds delightful. Those are probably all of my letting off steams, me drinking in front of a camera. Just be excited that you're going to get to see Carrie Ann and I drink a whole lot more on camera through letting off steam. And if you have not subscribed to our YouTube channel and hit that notification bell, make sure to do that, because that's the only way to find out when a letting off steam episode is coming up. And if you want to see Carrie Ann and I drunk, that's how you do it. That's where you're going to see it. Tomorrow, what's next week's discussion? I don't think we have a show next week scheduled at this point. So actually, we might be off in its entirety next week. We'll find out. Are my nails reusable or refurbishable? They are expendable. These are expendable nails. They get expended every week. They are a dip, and I'm still going through my tween years. And actually what it is as my nails grow, I hate the line that forms on the bottom. It drives me crazy, which means I don't like dark nails because that line becomes very, very apparent by like 3 or 4 days in. And it also means that even with light nails, I just have them remove the dip and put something else on just so that I don't have to see that line, because I am a pretty princess like that. I don't like the way that looks. But in doing that, because I do a dip as opposed to acrylic, my nails are fine, like the nail itself is fine, and I always have a really nice, clean nail bed. So my fingers themselves actually look clean. They don't look gooey, right? That's a fair. Read the one on the screen. Okay, is there a chance that letting off steam might perhaps discuss this cyclical nature between science fiction and fact? That's a good one. That's a really good idea. Yeah, because it does seem to happen in science fiction first. Like you look at your mobile phone, I don't have it on me, but you look at like your mobile phone and a Star Trek communicator, and that basically came to pass. Like a lot of that stuff is coming to pass. So I'm excited for Warp Drive, basically is what I'm saying. That's a really good idea. For Smoke Scale off of YouTube. I think, yeah. Yeah, I think, I don't know if we'll do an entire letting off steam on that topic, but I think that's definitely something that I would be willing to talk about, and I think would be fun to talk to you, the community, about kind of in our low latency roundtable mode. I think that would be fun. All right, that's, oh, there you go. That's the proper version. All right, I think that's it. I had a lot of fun. I hope y'all did too. Like I said, I'm a little bit rusty, but I didn't feel like, here you go, from Lisa. I'm doing a letting off steam today. Just a fwee, people. Just a fwee. Maybe in like 4 or 5 hours. Yeah, there you go. They can happen at any time. Anytime, any day, anytime. Make sure you're subscribed. All right. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll post this show on demand in the next few days. Again, most likely no space news, and there may not be a live show next week, but I'll work to keep the letting off steam shows going because those are fun too, I think. And we'll see you sometime in the future.